Congratulations. You just inherited a problem that isn't yours to solve, but you're going to listen to it anyway because it's 11 p.m. and you're tired enough that unsolved mysteries sound better than sleep medication. Here's the thing about old crimes. They don't stay buried. They sit in storage boxes like bad house guests, taking up space, waiting for someone with a USB cable and too much time on their hands to drag them back into the light. This is a story about the 1990s meeting the 2020s in a way no one expected. It's about hard drives and forgotten evidence and the kind of digital fingerprints that don't fade like ink on paper. It's about a family asking questions 3 decades later and getting answers they shouldn't have been able to get. So do yourself a favor. Dim the lights. Not for ambience, though that helps, but because your eyes are already tired, and there's something weirdly comforting about investigating cold cases in the dark. Get comfortable. Grab whatever you're going to grab. And if you have a fan, turn it on. There's something about white noise and crime narratives that just makes sense, like they were designed to go together, which they definitely weren't. But here we are. Before we go deeper, quick questions. What did people do before fingerprint powder? Probably had a lot more unsolved murders. But let's not get sad about that. How suspicious is too suspicious? We're about to find out. And why do criminals always run like they've never used their legs before? Honestly, panic does weird things to motor function, like subscribe or comment only if you actually enjoy this. We're not here for the algorithm. We're here because something doesn't add up, and you want to know why. Tell us where you're watching from. Your couch? Your commute? A waiting room at 2 a.m.? We want to know. Now, let's talk about the night that changed everything. Or rather, let's talk about the data that proved it should have changed everything 30 years ago. Margaret Chen lived the kind of life that looks unremarkable until you're examining it for clues. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., not 6:45, not 7 o'clock, but 6:47, she'd make coffee in a Mr. Coffee machine that had that particular burnt smell of appliances that had been loved too hard. She'd sit at the kitchen table with the local paper. She'd call her sister in Portland. This was 1994. Everyone still had routines that didn't involve screens. Her husband, David, worked in accounting. Margaret worked part-time at a dental office. They had 2 kids, a mortgage, a dog named Chester that barked at the mailman with the kind of commitment that suggested Chester believed the Postal Service was a personal threat. Nothing about Margaret Chen's life suggested anything unusual was happening, and that's exactly the problem. You see, when a life ends violently, people comb through the beginning looking for signs they missed. Red flags, warnings, conversations that meant something different in hindsight. Margaret's sister would spend 30 years wondering if she should have noticed something in those morning phone calls. She wouldn't find what she was looking for, because it wasn't there. What was there was something else entirely, something hiding in the spaces between the routine, something that wouldn't be visible until machines could read dust. The ordinary days kept happening. Margaret took the same route to work. She picked up groceries at the same store. She lived with a secret that hadn't even announced itself yet. And in a filing cabinet in the police evidence room, a computer hard drive sat in a cardboard box, waiting for technology to catch up with what it already knew. On March 14th, 1994, Margaret Chen didn't come home. Now pause on that. March 14th. Very specifically March 14th. In 1994, if someone didn't come home, you couldn't immediately text their location. You couldn't ping their phone. You couldn't check their email to see if they'd sent anything. You had to wait. You had to call the hospital. You had to call her friends. You had to spend hours in that particular flavor of confusion that only existed before GPS. David reported her missing around 8 p.m. By 11 p.m., the police were involved. By the next morning, Margaret Chen's disappearance had become the kind of local news story that shuts down a small community. These things happen in big cities, people thought. Not here. Not to someone's wife. The search started immediately, the kind that involved volunteers in the woods, organized by the police department, coordinated through phone trees, because that's how you coordinated searches in 1994. They searched creek beds. They searched abandoned properties. They asked neighbors if they'd seen her car. But here's what made this particular mystery different. There was a computer in the house, not a cell phone, not the kind of technology that would be everywhere by 2000, just a home computer that David used for work, a machine he brought home because he'd been working late on a project for his firm. No one looked at that computer. Not yet. Let's talk about the details that didn't fit the narrative everyone was creating. Margaret's purse was found 2 blocks from the house. Not in the woods. Not in a ditch. 2 blocks away, on a residential street, sitting like someone had put it down gently. Her wallet was still inside. Her car keys. Her driver's license. All the things a missing person would typically need if they'd run away. Except she hadn't. The timeline started getting strange. Neighbors reported seeing her leave the house around 3 p.m. She was supposed to pick up the kids from school at 3:15. She never showed up. The school called David at work. He came home. That's when the panic started. But here's the odd part. The neighbor who said she saw Margaret leave, he couldn't quite remember what she was wearing. He couldn't quite remember which direction she'd gone. When the police asked him 3 separate times over 2 days, the details changed. Not dramatically, just slightly, like memories do. David said he'd been at work all day. His company confirmed it. But when the police checked the computer logs, and they only checked them because a junior officer, maybe 23 years old, suggested they might be worth looking at, they found something odd. The computer had been powered down at 3:14 p.m., not 3:15, not 3 o'clock, 3:14 p.m. Someone had been using that computer right up until the moment Margaret disappeared. Marriages are complicated. This is not a profound statement. This is just what happens when 2 people share a mortgage in a bathroom and a legal document that says they're supposed to be able to read each other's minds. David Chen was having an affair. This is not a prediction. This is established fact, uncovered during the original investigation, which made the police very interested in David Chen as a suspect. Very interested indeed. Her name was Jennifer. She worked in his office. They'd been meeting in hotel rooms on Thursdays. This was 1994. Thursdays were still special then. Everyone has their Thursdays. Did David kill his wife? That was the question the police asked him, multiple times, in multiple rooms, with multiple levels of intensity. He said no. He lawyered up, and with a decent lawyer and no physical evidence, the case stalled. But motivation is strange. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. Sometimes it's something nobody considered because they were too busy looking at the obvious suspect. The computer at home belonged to David, but Margaret used it too. She'd been tracking household finances, checking email, doing the kinds of things people do on home computers before those things migrated permanently to phones. And according to the usage logs, the digital footprints that no one was really thinking about in 1994, Margaret had accessed the computer the morning of her disappearance. She'd found something. This is where the story becomes about data, which sounds boring, but isn't, because data is just evidence in a different language. And Margaret Chen left a trail that didn't fade. In 2019, 25 years after her disappearance, Margaret's sister finally asked the police to look at the old evidence. One more time, with new equipment, with new knowledge about how to read the electronic footprints that machines keep even when we think we've erased them. The hard drive from that 1994 computer still existed. It had been sitting in an evidence box in a climate-controlled room, waiting for technology to evolve. And when the forensic specialists got hold of it, they found something that would have been invisible in 1994. Margaret had accessed her husband's email. This wasn't sophisticated. She knew his password. She was his wife. She'd found correspondence between David and Jennifer, not the romantic kind, the kind where they discussed money, moving money, large amounts of money, money that belonged to David's firm. David had been embezzling for months, maybe longer. Jennifer was his accomplice, or maybe just his witness, or maybe something more complicated than either of those things. Margaret had discovered the evidence, printed it out, and saved it to the hard drive, and then Margaret had disappeared. The question wasn't whether Margaret's disappearance was connected to what she'd found. The question was why everyone had missed it for 25 years. The answer was simple and terrible. Because in 1994, nobody knew how to read what machines remember. The investigation that reopened in 2019 was different from the one in 1994. This time, the forensic team had tools that understood the language computers speak. They could see what files had been created. They could see what had been deleted, and more importantly, they could see what had been partially overwritten, which is its own kind of evidence. They found Margaret's email account, password protected, but the digital forensics team had ways around that. They found emails between David and Jennifer going back 18 months. They found a draft email from Margaret to a divorce attorney, saved but never sent, dated March 14, 1994, at 2:47 p.m. They found evidence of a wire transfer scheduled for that same evening. $1 million, moving from David's firm's account to an account in the Cayman Islands. The money was never transferred, because at 3:14 p.m., the computer shut down, and shortly after, Margaret stopped existing in any way that mattered to her family. The hard drive also contained information about a storage unit that David had rented 2 days before Margaret disappeared, a unit that had been paid for in cash every month for 24 years through a property management company that kept terrible records. When the police obtained a warrant and opened that storage unit in 2020, they found Margaret Chen. The trial lasted 6 weeks. David Chen's lawyers argued about chain of custody. They argued about the reliability of digital forensics. They argued that the emails could have been fabricated. They argued that Margaret could have run away. They argued everything except innocence, because innocence doesn't require that many arguments. But the digital evidence was overwhelming. The hard drive told a story that 3 separate forensic teams confirmed independently. The storage unit held physical evidence that the hard drive had predicted. It all fit together in a way that true things fit together, perfectly, inevitably, like pieces that were always meant to connect. Jennifer was arrested too. She'd known. She'd stayed silent for 25 years, which is its own kind of complicity. Her sentence was less severe, but the machinery of justice ground on regardless. David Chen was convicted of first-degree murder in 2021, 27 years after crime. He was sentenced to life without parole. In that time, he'd married again. He'd had other children. He'd lived an entire secondary life while Margaret Chen sat in a storage unit, waiting for machines to be smart enough to talk about what he'd done. Here's what makes this story different from other murders. The evidence was always there. Digital forensics didn't discover something new. It translated something old. The hard drive had preserved Margaret's fear, her discovery, her last hours of research and realization. The computer had documented her husband's crime before anyone knew to look for it. In 1994, when Margaret died, the technology to catch David Chen didn't exist. By 2019, it did, and that gap, that space between the crime and the capability to prove it, that's what gave him 25 years of freedom. That's what let him build another life while his first wife decomposed in the dark. But the data remembered. The hard drive never forgot. And sometimes that's enough. So here you are at the end of Margaret Chen's story, which is also the beginning of the proof of David Chen's crime. You came for a mystery and got a lesson in how the invisible is becoming less invisible every year. How machines are better at remembering than people. How the past is a way of catching up, even when we think we've buried it deep enough. Where are you now? Still in the dark room? Still comfortable? The fan still running? Good. That's exactly where you should be. Not because the story was comfortable, but because you made it that way. You controlled the space. You control when to listen and when to pause. That's what these stories are for, a moment of control in a world that doesn't always offer it. Like this if it stayed with you. Subscribe if you want more of them. Comment where you're listening from, and if this made you think about something you haven't thought about in years. Tell us that too. We read those. We noticed them. Next time we'll talk about another case, another mystery, another moment when the past refused to stay quiet. Until then, keep that fan on. Keep the lights dim. And remember, technology is watching everything. Sometimes that's exactly what justice needs. You made it through the night. That's not nothing. You sat with a story about loss and deception, and the slow machinery of justice catching up to someone who thought he'd escaped. You let yourself feel that discomfort, and somehow you're still here, still listening, which means you're the kind of person who can hold difficult truths without looking away. Margaret Chen didn't get a fair ending. She got a late ending, 27 years late, but her sister got answers. Her children got closure. And somewhere in a courtroom in 2021, a machine that didn't exist when Margaret was alive testified against the man who killed her. That's not revenge. That's not satisfaction. But it's something. It's the smallest version of justice, arriving decades too late, but arriving nonetheless. The technology that caught David Chen will only get better. Every year, digital forensics becomes more sophisticated. Every year, the machines remember more. Every year, the past becomes harder to bury. That's a complicated thing to sit with. It means safety is improving. It means killers are fewer. It means families don't have to wait 30 years for answers they deserved immediately. But it also means we're living in a world where nothing is ever truly gone. Every email, every file, every digital footprint you leave persists somewhere in the architecture of networks and hard drives and cloud servers. That's not inherently bad. It's just the cost of the age we're in. We trade privacy for permanence. We trade solitude for security. Margaret Chen would have wanted that trade. Given the choice between anonymity and an unsolved death, every missing person chooses the same way. They choose to be found. So tomorrow, when you check your email, when you browse your history, when you delete files thinking they're gone, remember that machines remember differently than we do. They don't forget. They don't rationalize. They don't rewrite the story to make themselves feel better. They just keep the evidence, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Be kind to people around you. Be honest in the things you do. Not because you're being watched, though you probably are in small ways, but because every action leaves a mark. Every choice gets recorded somewhere. The machines might not care about your kindness, but the people in your life do. And unlike hard drives, people can actually feel it. This is the part where the channel ends, but your night doesn't have to. Let the fan keep running. Let your eyes adjust back to the light slowly, the way eyes do. Don't jolt yourself awake. Let yourself drift down from this story naturally, the way you would if someone were telling it to you in person, and their voice just kept getting quieter. Margaret Chen deserved better. Everyone in this story deserved better. But at least finally they got the truth. Until next time, we'll be here, in the dark, with the fan running, waiting for the next cold case that refuses to stay cold, waiting for the next digital ghost to speak from beyond the grave of forgotten evidence. Keep watching. Keep listening. Keep the lights dim.